The house was always quietest right before Richard came home. It was the only time Katherine could stand still in the hallway without feeling the silent weight of his expectations. She spent these late afternoons quietly aligning the numbers in her mind to cover the small, unexplained deficits that had begun to appear in their joint checking account over the past few weeks. Richard always assured her it was just the cost of keeping up appearances, but the math never quite settled into place. She ignored the faint, cold knot of unease in her stomach, telling herself that every marriage had its invisible costs. But lately, the quiet of the house felt less like peace and more like a breath being held, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the first crack to show. She walked into the kitchen, the dim light of the afternoon fading into shadow, her damp cloth resting in her palm, as she waited for the heavy silence to break. The kitchen clock ticked with a heavy plastic thud every 60 seconds. It was a cheap thing bought at a hardware store 3 years ago, its faux bronze frame already peeling at the edges. Katherine focused on that sound as she wiped the counter. The microfiber cloth was damp with diluted white vinegar, leaving a thin, evaporating film on the gray-veined quartz. Richard did not look up when he entered. He let the heavy wooden front door slam shut, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and rattled the empty wine glasses in the upper cabinet. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen island. The heavy leather fob of his leased Audi Q7 landed with a sharp clack, sliding across the polished surface until it stopped an inch from Katherine's damp cloth. "My mother called," Richard said, his thumb flicking across the screen of his phone. He was already walking toward the refrigerator, his steps heavy and hurried. "She says the hip is flaring up again. I told her we would send over that massage therapist next week, the one from the plaza. It is $60 an hour, but she needs it." Katherine did not stop her hand. She moved the cloth in neat, overlapping circles. "We paid for her physical therapy copay last Friday, Richard. That was $240. "It is my mother, Katherine," he said. He pulled open the refrigerator door, the seal releasing with a soft hiss. He stood in the cool yellow light, staring at the shelves without really seeing them. "What am I supposed to do? Let her suffer? Family comes first, you know that." He reached for the carton of organic orange juice, poured himself a glass, and left the empty carton on the middle shelf, even though there were only 2 drops left at the bottom. He did not put the cap back on tightly. It was a small thing, a routine negligence that Katherine observed without comment. To point it out would require an argument, and an argument would require energy she did not wish to spend on him tonight. Instead, she watched him carry the glass to the island. He set it down without a coaster, leaving a faint, sticky ring of orange pulp on the clean quartz. "We need to talk about the anniversary," Richard said, tapping his phone screen with a manicured nail. "It is their 41st. Last year we did nothing because of my father's surgery. This year we have to do it right. I was thinking the pavilion at the country club. Julian says he can get us a discount through one of his clients, but we still need to secure the date. The deposit is $3,000. Katherine paused, her hand resting on the damp cloth. She felt the cool moisture soaking into the tips of her fingers. "The country club is outside our bracket, Richard. Our credit card balance from the winter holidays is still sitting at $4,000. We are barely clearing the minimum payments." "That is different," Richard said quickly, his voice rising just enough to signal his annoyance. He finally looked at her, but his eyes did not meet hers. They hovered somewhere around her collarbone, impatient and dismissive. "The credit card is just standard household stuff. This is a milestone. My parents have given us everything. If we do not throw this party, Julian and Clara will think we are struggling. My mother will feel slighted. Do you want her to think we do not care?" He used the word we, but Katherine knew the division of labor. Julian, Richard's older brother, lived in a sprawling colonial-style home 3 miles away, drove a luxury sedan he bought used, and spoke loudly about his investments while never offering to pay for a single family dinner. Clara, his wife, spent her afternoons posting pictures of her organic garden on social media. When Arthur and Evelyn needed help, it was always Richard who volunteered, and it was always Katherine's savings that absorbed the impact. Katherine took a slow, quiet breath. She calculated the numbers in her head. Her personal savings account, the one her mother had told her to keep in her own name before she passed away, held $12,412. It was money saved from her salary as a freelance document reviewer, painstaking, eye-straining work that she did late at night while Richard slept. Richard did not know the exact balance. He knew only that whenever the joint account dipped into the red, Katherine always managed to transfer just enough to prevent the checks from bouncing. To him, her savings were not a finite resource earned through sacrifice. They were a natural utility, like water from a well that never ran dry. "The deposit is $3,000, she said softly. "And the total cost?" "Probably around $8," Richard said, shifting his weight. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through a gallery of event photos. "But we will get some of that back in gifts, probably. And Julian said he would chip in, eventually. You know how his cash flow is right now with the new office." Julian's cash flow had been restricted for 4 years, yet he had just installed a saltwater pool in his backyard. Katherine knew Julian would never pay a dime. Richard knew it too, but admitting it would mean acknowledging that his brother was selfish, which would damage the fragile image of family unity Richard spent so much energy maintaining. $8,000 is 2 months of mortgage payments, Katherine said. "Why do you always do this?" Richard sighed, throwing his hands up in a theatrical gesture of frustration. "You always bring everything down to pennies. It is exhausting, Katherine. We are talking about my parents' anniversary. This is not the time to be cheap. I already told my dad we would handle the venue. He was so proud. He almost cried." He walked out of the kitchen, his leather loafers squeaking slightly on the hardwood floor of the hallway. "Just look at the budget tomorrow. We can make it work. We always do." The television in the living room flared to life, the loud, brassy theme music of a sports broadcast filling the house. Katherine stood alone in the kitchen. She looked down at the circular damp patch on the counter. It was already beginning to dry, leaving behind a faint, dull ring where the vinegar had stripped the cheap sealant. She did not follow him. She did not yell. Slowly, she picked up her damp cloth, folded it into a neat, tight square, and placed it on the edge of the sink. She took the near-empty carton of orange juice from the refrigerator, poured the last 2 drops into the sink, and rinsed the cardboard before putting it in the recycling bin. Then she sat down at the small desk in the corner of the kitchen and opened her laptop. The screen illuminated her face with a pale blue glow. She logged into her personal bank portal. The balance stared back at her, $12,412. She clicked on the transaction history. Over the last 6 months, there were 9 separate transfers to their joint checking account, labeled simply as overdraft protection. She closed that tab and opened the page for her personal savings. She hovered her mouse over the account settings. In the living room, Richard laughed loudly at something on the television. Katherine's finger hovered over the trackpad. Her face remained entirely blank, but her breath was steady, slow, and cold. The blue mist of a Wednesday morning pressed heavily against the kitchen window. Katherine stood by the stove, watching the blue flame hiss beneath the copper kettle. The copper had lost its shine years ago, covered in a faint, greasy film of cooking oil that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. While the water heated, she held her phone. Her thumb did not shake. She navigated to the external transfer settings of her personal savings account. With 3 quiet taps, she unlinked the automatic overdraft protection from the joint checking account. A small box popped up on the screen, asking if she was sure she wanted to disable this feature. Disabling overdraft protection may result in declined transactions or non-sufficient funds fees, the warning read. She tapped the button marked Confirm. The kettle began to whistle, a low, breathy rattle, before it reached its high, piercing note. She turned off the gas before the sound could wake Richard. Richard came down the stairs 15 minutes later, his tie still draped loose around his neck. He was wearing his gray suit, the one that cost $800 and had to be dry cleaned. He smelled of cologne, a heavy blend of sandalwood and black pepper that lingered in the hallway long after he left. "Is there any of that hazelnut coffee left?" he asked, not looking at her as he rifled through his leather briefcase on the dining table. "I made pour-over," Katherine said, pouring her own cup. The black liquid was thin and steaming. Richard frowned, looking at the empty glass carafe of the drip machine. "You didn't make a pot?" "I have a client presentation at 9. I don't have time to wait for a single cup." "The coffee maker is dirty," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of apology. "It needs to be descaled. The vinegar takes about an hour to run through." Richard let out a sharp, impatient breath. "Forget it. I'll grab a cold brew at the station. It's probably better anyway." He zipped his briefcase with a loud, aggressive pull. "Oh, by the way, I talked to the caterer for the anniversary, a guy named Marcus. He is a friend of Julian's. He said he can hold the date if we get him a $500 holding fee by tomorrow. I told him I would write him a check tonight." Katherine took a slow sip of her coffee. The hot liquid burned the tip of her tongue, but she did not flinch. She knew the joint checking account held exactly $84.12. The automated payment for Richard's leased Audi, a massive $750 monthly draft, was scheduled for tomorrow morning. "The check is on the pad in the drawer," she said. "Great. I will grab it when I get home," Richard said. He picked up his keys from the island, the heavy fob clacking against the wood. He paused, looking at her coffee mug. "Are you feeling okay? You seem quiet." "I am just tired," Katherine said. "Right. Well, don't forget to look at the country club pricing I emailed you. We need to lock this down before Julian starts looking at other venues. He is really pushing for the golf club, but that is way more expensive, and I want to show him we can handle the pavilion on our own." He did not wait for her response. The front door opened, letting in a gust of cold, damp morning air, and then slammed shut. A moment later, the low rumble of his Audi engine purred in the driveway, followed by the crunch of gravel as he backed out. Katherine stood at the window, watching the taillights of his car disappear around the corner. She looked down at her coffee. The surface of the dark liquid reflected the pale blue light of the morning. She went back to the kitchen counter. There was a stack of mail sitting next to the toaster. She sorted through it with methodical precision. An electric bill, $212. A credit card statement. The minimum payment was $180, due in 3 days. A flyer for a local landscaping service that Richard had called to trim the hedges because he didn't want the neighbors to think they couldn't afford yard maintenance. She set the bills in a neat pile on the corner of the island, right where Richard always left his keys. In the quiet house, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. It was a rhythmic, rattling vibration that seemed to match the steady, patient beating of her own heart. She had spent 5 years being the shock absorber for his family's vanity. Every time his mother complained, every time his brother bragged, every time Richard felt the sting of inadequacy, her savings had been the quiet cushion that softened the blow. Now the cushion was gone. The ledger was closed. She picked up her mug, walked to the dining table, and sat down. For the first time in years, she did not feel the heavy, pressing panic of how they would pay the bills. She felt nothing but a cool, clear space opening up inside her mind. She took another sip of her coffee and waited for the day to begin. The cursor blinked steadily against the white screen of the laptop. Katherine squinted, her eyes burning from 3 straight hours of reviewing an 80-page commercial lease. The text was a dense thicket of clauses, indemnities, and termination triggers. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a small plastic bottle of lubricating eye drops. The plastic gave a dry, rhythmic click as she squeezed 2 cold drops into each eye, blinking rapidly as the liquid spilled over her eyelashes and rolled down her cheeks like artificial tears. Her phone vibrated on the desk. The wooden surface amplified the buzz, a low, demanding rattle that she let ring twice before picking it up. Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. "Hello, Evelyn," Katherine said, her voice dropping into the quiet, patient register she had spent years perfecting. "Katherine, dear," Evelyn said. Her mother-in-law's voice was thin and melodic, carrying the practiced warmth of someone who spent her life avoiding unpleasantness. "I hope I am not interrupting your little editing project." "I am just finishing up a contract, Evelyn. Is everything all right?" "Oh, absolutely fine, dear. It is just that Richard mentioned you were starting to coordinate with Marcus for the anniversary. I wanted to make sure you tell him that we absolutely cannot have shellfish on the menu. Your father's gout has been so dreadful lately, and Julian's wife, Clara, is doing that new raw food cleanse this month. We will need a completely separate vegan platter for her. I am sure it won't be a bother to add that to the order." "I will make a note of it," Katherine replied. She did not point out that adding specialized vegan menus to a country club catering package usually incurred a 20% surcharge per plate. "Wonderful," Evelyn said, her tone light and satisfied. "Oh, and dear, while you are out this afternoon, could you do me a tiny favor? I had my lavender dress altered at La Petite Boutique downtown, the one near the park. They finished it this morning. It is $75. I told the young lady there that my daughter-in-law would pop in and grab it. You don't mind, do you?" "Of course," Katherine said. I can stop by on my way to the grocery store." "You are an absolute angel, Katherine. Richard is so lucky to have a wife who is so supportive of his family. You really are the glue that keeps us all together, dear." Katherine stared at the blinking cursor on her computer screen. The glue, she thought, the invisible adhesive that held the porcelain together, absorbing all the cracks until it eventually degraded and crumbled, entirely unnoticed. "I will pick it up, Evelyn. Have a nice afternoon." "Thank you, dear. Give Richard my love." The line went dead with a soft click. Katherine sat in the silence of her study for a long moment. She picked up her phone and opened her banking application. She logged into the joint checking account. Balance, $84.12. She closed the application, shut her laptop, and stood up. Her knees made a dull pop in the quiet room. The drive to the boutique was quiet. Katherine drove her 7-year-old compact sedan. The air conditioning had a persistent dry rattle when set to high, and the steering wheel had a slight pull to the left, but the vehicle was fully paid for. It was reliable, humble, and entirely her own. The afternoon heat radiated off the asphalt as she parked in the boutique's designated space. Above the door of La Petite Boutique, a brass bell chimed with a high, clear ring as she walked in. The shop smelled of expensive lavender sachets, pressed linen, and wood polish. A young woman behind the counter, her hair swept up in a flawless bun, looked up with a polite, vacant smile. "Can I help you?" "I am here to pick up an alteration for Evelyn," Katherine said. The girl nodded and disappeared into the back room. She returned a moment later carrying a heavy, glossy white garment box tied with a thick black silk ribbon. "Here we are, the lavender silk. That will be $75 even, ma'am." Katherine reached into her leather purse. Her fingers brushed past her personal debit card, the sapphire blue plastic linked to her private savings. Instead, she reached into the small side pocket where she kept the charcoal gray joint debit card. The plastic was slightly scuffed at the edges, the raised silver numbers of Richard's name partially faded. She slid the card into the reader. The small screen of the terminal blinked. "Processing," it read. Katherine watched the little wheel spin on the tiny screen. She did not hold her breath. She did not feel her heart race. She felt only a strange, mathematical detachment, like a scientist watching a chemical reaction reach its predictable boiling point. The machine let out a sharp, cheerful double beep. "Approved." "Thank you," the cashier said, sliding the heavy box across the counter. "Would you like the receipt in the box or in your hand?" "In my hand, please," Katherine said. She took the slip of thermal paper. She folded it neatly in half, then in half again, before placing it inside her purse. The transaction was complete. The joint checking account, which held $84.12, now held exactly $9.12. Tonight, Richard would come home, boasting about his client meeting, and write a $500 deposit check to Marcus, the caterer. Tomorrow morning at precisely 6 o'clock, the automated payment for Richard's leased Audi Q7, $750, would attempt to clear the joint account. Katherine walked out of the boutique, the heavy white box resting in the crook of her arm. The brass bell chimed behind her, its clear ring dissolving quickly into the dry, hot air of the afternoon street. The rhythmic, heavy thud of the chef's knife against the wooden cutting board was the only sound in the kitchen. Katherine stood at the counter, slicing yellow onions into thin, translucent half-moons. The sharp, stinging sulfur of the raw onions rose into the air, making her eyes water slightly, but she did not wipe them. She welcomed the physical distraction. She moved on to the potatoes, peeling away the dusty brown skin to reveal the damp, starchy white flesh beneath. Behind her, the burner on the gas stove clicked 5 times before catching with a soft blue poof. She placed her heavy cast-iron skillet over the flame, pouring in a tablespoon of oil. Within moments, the faint metallic smell of hot iron and warming grease filled the room. The front door opened. Richard walked in, his shoulders high, his jacket already draped over one arm. He looked buoyant, a sharp contrast to his usual tired, irritable posture when he came home from the office. "You should have seen Julian's face today," Richard said, walking straight to the kitchen island without greeting her. "We were in the mid-quarter review with the regional director. Julian tried to take credit for the logistics report, but the director looked right past him and shook my hand first. He actually told Julian he could learn a few things from my presentation style." Katherine did not turn around. She slid the sliced onions into the hot skillet. The loud, angry sizzle erupted instantly, filling the kitchen with steam and the sweet, sharp scent of browning alliums. "That is nice, Richard," she said, stirring the onions with a wooden spoon. "Nice? It is huge, Katherine. It practically guarantees my promotion by the end of the fiscal year." He set his briefcase on the stool and noticed the glossy white garment box from La Petite Boutique resting on the far end of the island. "Oh, you got the dress. Perfect. My mother is going to be thrilled. She was so worried the alterations wouldn't be finished in time. Did she say anything when you talked to her?" "She asked me to remind the caterer about your father's gout and Clara's diet," Katherine said, her eyes fixed on the onions as they softened and turned translucent in the hot oil. Richard laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Clara and her diets! Honestly, Julian spends a fortune on organic meal deliveries just so she can complain about her digestion. But whatever makes them happy, I guess." He pulled open the shallow utility drawer near the telephone. He rummaged through the clutter of expired coupons, rubber bands, and old menus until his fingers found the navy blue vinyl cover of their joint checking account checkbook. He slid onto one of the bar stools, pulling the checkbook toward him. He reached into his breast pocket and produced his heavy, gold-plated pen, a graduation gift from his father that he treated with immense reverence. "I am going to write this check to Marcus now," Richard said, unscrewing the cap of the pen with a slow, deliberate twist. He said if I get it to him tonight, he can drop by the country club pavilion tomorrow morning to lock in our date before the weekend rush. We are officially on the books, Katherine. Katherine watched him out of the corner of her eye. She did not stop stirring the onions. Richard opened the checkbook. He wrote the date in his large, looping script. On the line marked "Pay to the order of," he wrote Marcus Vance. On the small line to the right, he carefully penned the numbers, 500.00. Katherine made a quiet mental calculation. The joint account currently held $9.12. Tomorrow morning at precisely 6 o'clock, the automated payment gateway for Richard's leased Audi Q7 would initiate its monthly draft of $750. If the Audi draft hit first, the transaction would be declined due to non-sufficient funds. The bank would immediately assess a $35 penalty fee. The account balance would plunge into the negative. When Marcus the caterer attempted to deposit the $500 check later that afternoon, the check would bounce spectacularly. Another $35 fee would be tacked onto the account. Marcus, who is a close friend of Richard's brother, would receive a notice from his bank stating the funds were unavailable. He would undoubtedly call Julian or Richard or both, demanding an explanation. Richard signed his name at the bottom of the check with his usual flourishes, the loopy R stretching across half the line. He tore the check from the book. The perforated paper made a sharp, dry rip in the quiet kitchen. "There," Richard said, sliding the check into a long white envelope he had taken from his briefcase. He sealed it with a flick of his tongue and tapped it against the counter. One major hurdle down. We are really making this happen. He looked over at the stack of mail Katherine had left on the corner of the island. He flipped through the envelopes casually. Electric bill, landscaping, credit card, he muttered, tossing them back down. "We can handle these on Friday when my paycheck clears. It is only 2 days. They can wait." He did not realize that the automated Audi draft did not wait for Friday. It was hard-coded into the banking system for the 17th of every month. For 3 years, Katherine had quietly logged into her personal portal on the 16th and moved $700 of her own money into the joint account to ensure the car payment cleared without issue. Richard had never once asked how the car was paid for. He simply assumed the money was always there, a natural consequence of his hard work. Tonight, there would be no transfer. Katherine scraped the chopped potatoes into the skillet alongside the onions. The hot grease popped, a tiny droplet landing on the back of her hand. It stung, a sharp prick of heat, but she did not make a sound. She simply wiped it away with the edge of her apron. "What is for dinner?" Richard asked, looking up from his phone. "Just chicken and potatoes," she said. "No salad?" Richard pouted slightly, his brow furrowing. "Clara was telling me that we really need to incorporate more raw, leafy greens into our dinners. She says the enzymes are crucial for metabolic health." "We are out of greens," Katherine said, her voice smooth and even. Richard sighed, returning his attention to his phone screen. "Well, whatever. I am going to go upstairs and change out of my suit. Let me know when it is on the table." He gathered his briefcase and his white envelope, his heavy leather loafers squeaking on the hardwood as he walked down the hall. Katherine stood over the stove, watching the potatoes slowly brown around the edges. She picked up the wooden spoon and turned them over one by one with absolute, unhurried patience. The digital bedside clock cast a faint green glow across the dark bedroom. It was 11:42. Beside her, Richard slept deeply, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, a low snore escaping his lips every few seconds. Katherine lay on her back, her eyes wide, staring up at the ceiling. Outside, a passing car swept a slow, pale arc of light across the plaster, illuminating the room for a brief moment before plunging it back into shadow. She felt no anger, no racing pulse, no burning desire to wake him and demand an explanation. She felt only a profound, silent stillness. Her mind was entirely clear, operating with the cold, deliberate precision of a ledger. She woke before the alarm. At 5:45, the bedroom was still painted in the cool, blue-gray tones of pre-dawn. Katherine slipped out from under the heavy comforter, her feet meeting the cold, hardwood floor. She did not make a sound. She did not look at Richard as she pulled her knit cardigan over her shoulders and quietly closed the bedroom door behind her. The stairs were cold. In the kitchen, she did not turn on the overhead lights. Instead, she navigated by the dim morning light filtering through the window above the sink. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, watching the small blue ring of fire ignite with a soft, familiar hiss. While the water heated, she sat at the dining table. She wrapped her hands around her ceramic mug, absorbing the dry, radiating warmth of the clay. She looked out at the backyard. A thick, silver morning fog clung to the grass, obscuring the fence line and swallowing the neighbor's yard in a silent, misty void. At precisely 6 o'clock, she looked down at the watch on her wrist. The digital numbers ticked over. 600. Katherine did not open her phone. She did not need to. She knew how the banking infrastructure operated. At this exact hour, the automated clearinghouse batch processing for their local branch completed its daily cycle. The automated merchant draft from Audi Financial Services would have initiated its request. The system would have searched for $750 in the joint checking account. Finding only $9.12, the system would have immediately aborted the transfer, flagged the transaction as returned unpaid due to non-sufficient funds, and automatically assessed a $35 penalty fee. In a fraction of a second, the joint account balance had shifted from positive $9.12 to negative $25.88. The silent digital gears of the bank had turned, and Richard had no idea. At 7:15, a loud, panicked rustling came from the stairs. Richard scrambled down into the kitchen, his hair still damp and messy, his tie hanging crookedly over his shoulder. He was only half-shaved, a small patch of dried shaving cream still clinging to his jawline. "Why didn't you wake me?" he demanded, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "My alarm went off, but I must have slept right through it. I have to meet Marcus at the country club at 8. If I am late, Julian is going to spend the whole weekend talking about how I cannot manage a basic schedule." "I thought you needed the rest," Katherine said softly, taking a slow sip of her warm tea. "You had such a long, important day yesterday. I wanted to let you sleep." Richard grunted, too frantic to register any subtext. He grabbed his briefcase from the island and stuffed his gold-plated pen into his pocket. He snatched the white envelope containing the $500 check from the counter, sliding it carefully into his breast pocket. "If I leave right now, I can still make it," he muttered, checking his watch. He did not look at his phone for notifications. He was too consumed by the immediate logistics of his morning rush. He grabbed his keys, the heavy metal clacking loudly in the quiet kitchen. "Do you have everything you need?" Katherine asked, standing up and smoothing the front of her cardigan. Yes. I have the check," he said, stepping toward the front door. He paused, turning back to give her a quick, distracted kiss on the cheek. His lips were dry, smelling faintly of mint toothpaste. "See you tonight. Oh, and can you call my mother and tell her you picked up the dress? She was texting me about it last night, wanting to make sure it was safe." "I will call her," Katherine said. "Have a good day," he called out as he opened the door, letting in a sharp gust of cold, foggy morning air. The heavy oak door shut with a solid, echoing thud that vibrated through the entryway. Katherine stood in the hall for a moment, listening to the gravel crunch outside as his Audi backed down the driveway. The engine purred, a smooth, expensive sound that grew fainter and fainter until it was completely swallowed by the morning fog. She walked back into the kitchen. She picked up her tea mug and carried it to her small desk in the corner. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face with its familiar pale blue glow. She did not log into the joint account. Instead, she opened her email and began her work, her fingers typing with steady, unhurried rhythm. She had spent 5 years preventing his small, careless mistakes from turning into disasters. She had spent 5 years being the invisible safety net, catching every dropped ball, paying every forgotten bill, and absorbing every financial shock to keep his pride intact. The net was gone now. The first domino had fallen. She only had to wait for the rest to follow. The small pot of vegetable broth simmered on the stove, sending up thin, fragrant plumes of steam that smelled of celery, bay leaves, and black pepper. Katherine stood over it, her wooden spoon tracing slow circles in the golden liquid. She watched a single bay leaf float to the surface, spin slowly in the convection current, and sink back down beneath the surface. It was 1:30 in the afternoon. Her phone, resting on the wooden dining table behind her, began to vibrate. It did not ring. She kept the ringer off during her working hours. The hard plastic casing rattled against the oak veneer, a dry, urgent buzz that repeated 3 times before stopping, only to start again 10 seconds later. She did not rush. She set the wooden spoon on a ceramic rest, turned the gas burner down to a low simmer, and walked over to the table. Richard's name was flashing on the screen. She swiped to answer and pressed the phone to her ear. "Katherine," Richard said. His voice was unusually tight, pitched in a low, hurried whisper. He was clearly at his desk at the office, likely leaning forward over his keyboard to keep his words from carrying over the low cubicle partition. "Katherine, are you there?" "Yes, Richard, I am here." "I just got a text alert from the bank," he hissed, "and an email from Audi Financial. They are saying the auto pay for the Q7 was declined. They said it was returned for non-sufficient funds. What is going on? Did the bank have a system glitch?" "I don't think it is a glitch," Katherine said. Her voice was smooth, cool, and entirely devoid of the panic he was projecting. "Well, why did it decline?" Richard asked, his whisper growing sharper, more demanding. "The car payment is $750. It goes through on the 17th. It always goes through on the 17th. Did you forget to move the money over?" "Which money, Richard?" "The money for the car," Richard said, his frustration bubbling through his forced whisper. "You know what I mean. The transfer from your account, the one that covers the mid-month drafts." "I didn't make a transfer this month, Richard," she said. She walked back to the stove, picked up the wooden spoon, and gave the soup a slow, gentle stir. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The only sound was the distant hum of Richard's office ventilation and the faint click of someone typing on a mechanical keyboard nearby. "What do you mean you didn't make a transfer?" he finally asked, the words slow and heavy with disbelief. "Why not?" "Because I didn't have the surplus," she said. She watched the bubbles rise from the bottom of the pot. My client payments for the quarterly contracts are delayed this month, and my estimated business tax payment was due yesterday. I had to prioritize those. "But Katherine," Richard stammered, his whisper cracking slightly, "you should have told me. If the car payment doesn't go through, they charge a $50 late fee, and the bank just hit us with a $35 fee for the bounce transaction. I just looked at the app. The joint account is negative $25. How is that even possible? Did you pay something else?" "I picked up your mother's dress yesterday," she said. "It was $75. Richard's breath hitched. "Oh, right. But still, $75 shouldn't have cleared out the entire account. There should have been a buffer." "There was $84 in the account before the dress," Katherine explained calmly. She took a pinch of salt from a small salt cellar and let it fall into the pot. $84? Richard echoed. "Why was it so low? My paycheck went in 2 weeks ago." "Yes," she said, "and from that paycheck, we paid the mortgage, the insurance, the minimum payment on the credit card, and you transferred $500 to your mother for her physical therapy and grocery bills. That left $84. Richard was silent. Katherine could practically hear the physical effort of his brain trying to calculate the numbers he had ignored for years. He had always viewed the joint account as an endless reservoir, never tracking the outflows because the total balance somehow always remained just above water by the time the next bill arrived. He had never realized that the reservoir was being constantly fed by a quiet, steady trickle of her own savings. "But what about the check?" Richard whispered suddenly, a sharp note of panic creeping into his voice. "What check?" "The check I wrote to Marcus. He was at the country club at 8 this morning. I handed it to him myself. It was $500 for the catering deposit. Katherine, if the account is negative $25, that check is going to bounce." "Yes," Katherine said, "it probably will." "My God, Katherine," Richard groaned. He sounded like he was rubbing his temples, his voice muffled by his hand. "You don't understand. Marcus is Julian's friend. He did us a favor by holding the date without a formal contract. If that check bounces, Marcus is going to think we don't have the money. He is going to call Julian. Julian will tell Clara, and then my mother—" "Katherine, this is humiliating. You have to fix this." "I can't fix it, Richard," she said. "Just move $500 over from your savings," he pleaded. "Just until Friday. My paycheck hits on Friday. I will transfer it right back to you, I promise. Just do an instant transfer so the check doesn't bounce." "I don't have $500 to move," she said. Her voice remained entirely flat, a simple statement of fact. "My business account is locked for the tax audit preparation, and my personal savings are tied up in a non-withdrawal certificate for the next 60 days. I cannot touch it." "Katherine, please," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "This is my parents' 41st anniversary. We are talking about my family. We are talking about my reputation at the country club. If Julian finds out my check bounced, I will never hear the end of it. He will think I am a failure." "I understand," Katherine said, "but I cannot change the math, Richard." There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the line. Richard was breathing quickly, his pride thrashing against the cold reality of a negative bank balance. For the first time in their marriage, the invisible safety net had failed to appear, and he was left dangling over the edge of his own financial pretense. "I have to go," he finally muttered, his voice cold and tight. "I have to figure this out." He hung up without saying goodbye. The line clicked shut. Katherine set her phone back down on the table. She walked to the stove, took the lid, and placed it over the simmering pot of soup, sealing the steam inside. She stood there in the quiet kitchen, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound remaining. A faint, cold smile touched the corners of her mouth, gone as quickly as it had arrived. The laundry room was small, tucked into the dark hallway behind the kitchen. It smelled of warm dust, hot metal, and the faint, sweet scent of lavender fabric softener. Katherine stood in front of the dryer, pulling out Richard's work shirts one by one. They were warm to the touch, retaining the dry, artificial heat of the machine. She hung them on plastic hangers, smoothing the collars with her fingers. She pressed her palms flat against the cotton fabric of each sleeve, creasing them neatly, methodically. This was a physical routine she had performed every Thursday evening for years. Richard insisted on starch and ironed seams, but tonight she simply hung them as they were, leaving the faint, natural wrinkles in the fabric. The front door opened. There was no slam this time. The lock clicked into place with a slow, hesitant turn. Richard's footsteps in the hallway were quiet, dragging slightly on the hardwood floor. Katherine did not go out to meet him. She took another shirt from the dryer, slid it onto a hanger, and smoothed the back seam. Richard appeared in the doorway of the laundry room. He had taken his tie off, stuffing it carelessly into his jacket pocket. His collar was unbuttoned, his hair slightly disheveled where he had run his hands through it. He looked smaller, his shoulders curved inward, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent light of the utility room. "Julian called me," he said. His voice was flat, hollowed out by a deep, exhausting humiliation. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, staring down at his expensive leather loafers. Katherine did not stop her hands. She reached for another shirt. "Oh, how is he?" "He was laughing, Katherine," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly before he pulled it back into a tight, strained whisper. "He called me from his car. He said Marcus called him this afternoon. Marcus tried to process the check through his mobile banking app, and the system rejected it immediately. Non-sufficient funds. Julian wanted to know if we were having a little cash flow issue. He actually offered to write Marcus a personal check for us so we wouldn't lose the venue." He paused, waiting for her to say something, but Katherine remained silent. She hung the shirt on the rod above her head. The plastic hanger slid along the metal bar with a sharp, scraping sound. "Do you know how that felt?" Richard asked, his eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate anger. "Having my older brother ask me if I need a handout to pay for our parents' anniversary? He was smug, Katherine. He loved every second of it. I had to stand in the hallway outside my office and lie to him. I told him it was an administrative error on our business account. I told him our bank was doing a security transition and the funds were temporarily frozen." "I see," Katherine said. She reached into the dryer for the last item, a pair of Richard's cotton trousers. "I had to transfer $500 from my personal credit card to the joint account to cover the check," Richard said, his voice dropping into a dull, defeated rhythm. "But the credit card is already near its limit. The cash advance fee was $50, and the bank took another $35 for the bounced transaction." "I had to call Marcus and apologize, Katherine. I had to tell him the bank resolved the issue and he could rerun the check tomorrow." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading, searching her face for any sign of the supportive, accommodating wife he had always taken for granted. "Is there really nothing you can do?" he asked. "Can't you call your bank tomorrow morning? Surely they can release some of your savings early if you explain it as an emergency. They must have a policy for this." "There is no policy for a fixed-rate certificate, Richard," Katherine said. She folded the trousers over the hanger, matching the seams perfectly. "A premature withdrawal carries a 12% penalty, and the processing takes 5 business days anyway. Even if I did it, the money wouldn't arrive in time to help you." "But what about the Audi payment?" Richard asked, his voice rising in desperation. "It is still sitting there, declined. If I don't pay it by tomorrow, they are going to report it. My credit score will drop. I cannot have a late payment on my record. We are trying to buy into the country club membership next year. They do a full financial check." Katherine took the stack of hung shirts in her left hand. She stepped past him into the narrow hallway, forcing him to take a step back to let her pass. "We really need to sync our accounts better," Richard said, following her down the hall toward the bedroom. He was trying to rebuild his defenses, trying to find a way to distribute the blame so it didn't rest entirely on his own shoulders. "If you had told me your taxes were going to drain our buffer so completely, I wouldn't have written the check to Marcus today. We could have planned this. You should have kept me informed." "I told you on Tuesday night that we did not have the budget for the country club," Katherine said. Her voice was calm, conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "I told you our credit card balance was too high and that we were barely clearing the minimums. You told me I was bringing everything down to pennies and that it was exhausting." Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He stood in the middle of the hallway, his hands twitching at his sides. He wanted to argue, to find a loophole in her memory, but her recall was absolute, delivered with a cold, terrifying lack of emotion. He watched her walk into the master bedroom. She opened the closet door and hung his shirts in their designated section, spacing them precisely 2 inches apart. She turned back to him. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "No," he muttered, looking away. "I am not hungry. My stomach is in knots." "There is some vegetable soup on the stove," she said. "You can heat it up if you want." She walked past him again, heading back toward her small desk in the kitchen. Richard remained in the bedroom hallway, surrounded by the warm, lingering scent of lavender and the absolute, suffocating silence of a house that no longer felt like his own. He looked down at his phone, his thumb hovering over his banking application, staring at the negative numbers that seemed to mock every outward success he had spent his life trying to project. Katherine sat down at her computer. She opened her folder of active contracts. Her fingers settled onto the keyboard, her touch light and rhythmic, a steady tap, tap, tap that filled the quiet space of the house. The kitchen was dark, save for the single pendant light hanging low over the island. Katherine sat at the far end of the dining table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of hot water with lemon. The sharp, clean scent of the squeezed citrus rose with the steam, cutting through the heavy, stale air of the house. Across from her, Richard sat hunched over a yellow legal pad. He had a stack of printed credit card statements and bills spread out around him like a disorganized fan. His gold-plated pen was clutched tightly in his fist, his knuckles white. The light from his phone screen reflected off his face, casting a pale, greenish hue over his skin and highlighting the dark circles beneath his eyes. He had been scratching numbers onto the pad for nearly an hour, his pen making a dry, aggressive scraping sound against the paper. Every few minutes he would let out a long, shuddering sigh, run his hand through his hair, and aggressively scribble out a line of figures before starting over. "Katherine," he said, his voice scratchy and tired, "what is this $80 charge from 2 weeks ago? It just says auto draft utility. Is that a mistake?" "That is the water bill, Richard," she said, her voice quiet and steady. She took a slow sip of her lemon water. "It has been $80 every month for 3 years. "And the trash collection?" he muttered, his pen hovering over the paper. "It says 48. I thought it was 44. "It went up $4 in January," she said. "I mentioned it to you when we received the annual notice. You told me to just file it." He did not reply. He chewed on the cap of his pen, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. He was searching for a leak, some hidden error, some external fault that would explain why the math was refusing to cooperate. His paycheck was scheduled to deposit into the joint account at midnight, technically making it Friday morning. Under normal circumstances, he would view this biweekly deposit of $3,400 as a fresh start, a green light to spend freely on executive lunches, premium car washes, and golfing outings with Julian. But tonight, the yellow legal pad was showing him a different story. Katherine watched him quietly. She made her own internal calculations, tracking the numbers in her head with effortless precision. Richard's paycheck would bring in $3,400. But the immediate demands on that money were already waiting in line. First, the manual payment for his leased Audi Q7 had to be processed immediately to prevent a delinquency report. That was $750, plus the $50 late fee, totaling $800. Second, the credit card cash advance he had taken to cover the bounced caterer check had to be paid back to avoid a 24% interest rate. That was $500, plus the $50 cash advance fee, totaling $550. Third, the electric bill she had left on the counter was $212. Fourth, the landscaping bill for trimming the hedges was $150. Fifth, the bank fees for the 2 bounce transactions were $70. And finally, tomorrow was the biweekly schedule for his mother's regular allowance. He had promised her $500 every 2 weeks for her joint medication and organic groceries. Katherine added the numbers in her head. 800 plus 550 plus 212 plus 150 plus 70 plus 500. $2,282. Out of his $3,400 paycheck, more than 2/3 was already spent before he even woke up on Friday morning. That left him with exactly $1,118 to cover the next 2 weeks of his own gas, highway tolls, dry cleaning, and his share of the household groceries. And that was assuming he did not spend a single penny on himself, and that his mother did not call with another emergency. Richard dropped his pen. It clattered against the wood of the table, rolling until it hit the edge of her mug. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered, rubbing his face with both hands. His palms made a dry, rasping sound against his stubble. "There is nothing left. After I pay the car and the credit card, we are basically working with air. How have we been doing this? How did we pay for the winter trip? How did we pay for the dining room chairs?" "You had a bonus in December," she said softly, "and I had a large contract clear in January." "But my bonus was only $2,000, he said, looking up at her, his eyes wide and vacant. "The trip alone was $4,000, and the chairs were $1,200. Where did the rest come from?" "I covered it," Katherine said. She did not elaborate. She did not list the sacrifices she had made, the client work she had taken on during holidays, or the personal savings she had steadily funneled into the joint account to keep his lifestyle afloat. She let the simple 3-word statement hang in the dark kitchen like a heavy weight. Richard stared at her. For a fleeting second, a look of profound, terrifying realization crossed his face. He looked at the legal pad, then back at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He was realizing that the life he had built, the luxury car he leased, the image of success he projected to his brother and parents, was not built on his own achievement. It was a fragile, hollow shell held together by the quiet, invisible labor of the woman sitting across from him. And now she had stopped. "Can you—" he started, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. "Can you help me with the Audi payment tomorrow? Just $300. If you can cover $300, I can pay the rest and still have enough to transfer the money to my mom. She is expecting it, Katherine. I cannot tell her I don't have it. She will worry." "I cannot, Richard," she said. She picked up her mug, stood up from the table, and walked to the sink. She poured the remaining lemon water down the drain, the soft, gurgling sound of the liquid disappearing into the pipes, the only sound in the room. "I told you," she said, her back to him. "My accounts are locked for the tax preparation. I do not have the liquidity." She set the mug in the sink. She did not wash it. She walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone under the single harsh light, surrounded by his yellow legal pad and the cold, unyielding truth of his own math. The small stainless steel skillet sat over a low flame. Katherine dropped a pat of unsalted butter into the center. It melted quickly, sliding across the metal and foaming into a pale, sweet-smelling pool. She cracked a single egg into the pan. The white instantly turned opaque, bubbling slightly at the edges, with a soft, steady crackle. She watched it with quiet focus, her spatula resting lightly in her hand, waiting for the perfect moment to slide beneath the yolk. Richard sat at the kitchen island, his elbows resting on the quartz. He had not slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gray in the bright morning light filtering through the window. His laptop was open in front of him, but he was staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. At precisely 7:30, his phone began to ring. The high-pitched, cheerful default ringtone was jarring in the quiet house. Richard's shoulders tensed immediately. He looked at the caller identification. "It is my mother," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He didn't want to answer, but he knew that ignoring her would only trigger a wave of follow-up texts and calls to his office. He swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello, Mom," he said, trying to force his usual warm, confident tone. "Richard, sweetie," Evelyn's voice was loud enough for Katherine to hear through the receiver, even from several feet away. The connection was slightly metallic, carrying a faint, static hiss. "I am standing at the pharmacy register, dear. They are trying to ring up my prescription and my joint supplement, but the cashier says my card was declined. Did you forget to do the transfer this morning? The line is backing up behind me, and it is rather embarrassing." Richard's hand tightened around the phone. He glanced over at Katherine, but she did not look up from her egg. She flipped it with a smooth, practiced flick of her wrist. "Mom, I am so sorry," Richard said, his voice dropping into a hurried, apologetic register. "Our bank is undergoing a security transition today. Some of the transfers are delayed. Can you ask the cashier to hold the items for an hour? Or can you use your personal card just for this morning? I will have it sorted out shortly." "My personal card?" Evelyn sighed, her tone shifting into a sharp, wounded pout. "Richard, you know I don't like using that card. The interest rates are dreadful, and your father always says we should keep it clear for real emergencies. And Julian told me yesterday that you were throwing us that lovely party at the country club. Surely $65 for my joint medication isn't an issue if you are booking the pavilion." The country club. The mention of it was like a physical blow. Richard closed his eyes, his mouth twisting in silent pain. Julian had already bragged to their mother about the lavish venue, completely unaware that the deposit check had bounced the afternoon before. "It is not an issue, Mom," Richard said quickly, his voice tight. "It is just a technical delay with the bank. Let me see if I can do a manual override from my phone right now. Hold on." He pulled the phone away from his ear and opened his banking application with a series of frantic taps. His paycheck had deposited. The balance stood at $3,374.12. The $3,400 deposit minus the negative $25 balance from yesterday. But he had not paid the Audi lease yet. He had not paid the credit card cash advance. He had not paid the electric bill. And Marcus, the caterer, was rerunning the $500 check today. If he transferred the full $500 to his mother now, he would have $2,874 left. If he then paid the $750 car payment, the $50 late fee, the $550 credit card repayment, the $212 electric bill, the $150 landscaping invoice, and the $500 caterer check, he would be left with exactly $612 to survive the next 2 weeks. $612. He spent more than that on lunches and highway tolls in a normal month. Richard bit his lip. He tapped the screen, entering a different number into the transfer field. $250. "Mom," he said, bringing the phone back to his ear, "I just forced a manual transfer of $250. It should show up in your account in about 2 minutes. That will cover the pharmacy and your groceries for today. The rest of the transfer will clear this afternoon once the bank finish their system update." 250? Evelyn repeated, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Well, I suppose that will cover the medicine, but I will have to put back the fresh salmon I picked out for dinner. And your father was hoping to get his massage today. His back has been so stiff, Richard." "I will send the rest this afternoon, Mom. I promise," he pleaded, his voice thin and desperate. "Just get the medicine for now. I have to go. I'm running late for work." "Well, all right," Evelyn said, her tone cold and dry. "I hope this bank of yours gets its act together soon, Richard. It is very stressful for my blood pressure." "I know, Mom. Goodbye." He hung up and set the phone face down on the quartz counter. He let out a long, ragged breath, his forehead resting in his palms. Katherine slid her fried egg onto a white ceramic plate. The yolk was perfectly intact, a bright, glossy yellow dome resting on a bed of crispy, lacy whites. She carried the plate to the small corner table, bypassing the island entirely. She picked up her fork. She did not offer him a bite. She did not ask how his mother was doing. Richard looked up, watching her cut into the yolk. The yellow liquid spilled across the white plate in a slow, thick stream. "Katherine," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I only sent her half. I have never sent her half before. She was so disappointed." Katherine chewed slowly, savoring the rich, buttery taste of the egg. She swallowed before she spoke. "You have to manage your resources, Richard," she said. "But I still have to pay the car," he said, his voice rising with a frantic, wild energy. "And Marcus is cashing the check today. If I don't pay the credit card back, the interest is going to eat me alive next month. And my tank is on empty. I need $40 just to get to the office and back for the next few days." "You should probably prioritize the obligations that carry the highest fees," she said. She took another bite of her egg. Richard stared at her, his hands trembling slightly on the counter. He was looking for a partner, a teammate, someone to share the crushing weight of his sudden financial collapse. But all he found was a quiet, polite spectator, eating her breakfast in the morning light, watching him drown in the shallow pool of his own vanity. The lobby of the Municipal Credit Union was quiet, smelling of old paper, industrial carpet cleaner, and stale drip coffee. It was located in a modest brick building 3 miles from Katherine's house, far away from the gleaming glass and steel commercial bank where she and Richard kept their joint accounts. Katherine sat in a low, vinyl-upholstered chair near the corner window. She watched a dusty sunbeam pierce the heavy glass, illuminating the tiny particles of dust dancing in the air. On the desk in front of her was a neat stack of documents: her driver's license, her tax identification paperwork, and a brand new signature card. The bank representative, a quiet woman with reading glasses dangling from a beaded chain around her neck, smiled politely. "Everything looks correct, Mrs. Vance," the woman said, her voice soft and practiced. "This will establish your sole proprietorship business account, completely unlinked from any of your personal accounts at other institutions. We will also set up the high-yield savings vault as requested." "Thank you," Katherine said. She picked up the heavy black pen provided by the bank. Her hand was perfectly steady as she signed her name at the bottom of the card. The blue ink was wet and dark against the crisp white paper. This was her physical routine, not cleaning, cooking, or managing Richard's anxiety, but the quiet, deliberate assembly of her own independence. While the representative processed the paperwork, Katherine's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. It was a persistent, frantic rhythm. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. There were 5 unread text messages from Richard, all sent within the last 20 minutes. "Julian cornered me at lunch," the first message read. "He paid for the whole table," the next one said. "He made some joke in front of the director about how my bank must be auditing me because my card was acting up yesterday." I wanted to sink into the floor. "Katherine, please," the third message pleaded. My mom called again. She was crying because she couldn't book Dad's massage and had to put her groceries back. She thinks we are angry with her. She thinks you are forcing me to cut her off. Please transfer the other $250. I will do anything. I will cancel my gym membership. I will sell my old golf clubs. Just help me save face with my family. The last message was just a single sentence. I am losing my mind here. Katherine read the messages twice. Her expression did not change. Her pulse did not elevate. She made a quick, cold, internal calculation. Her largest freelance contract, a major document review project for a corporate law firm, paid $4,500 on the first of every month. For 5 years, that money had been direct deposited straight into the joint checking account, immediately disappearing into the black hole of Richard's luxury car lease, his parents' allowances, and the credit card bills he accumulated trying to match Julian's lifestyle. But today was the 26th of the month. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small printed document. It was a direct deposit authorization form for her primary client. She had already filled out the routing number and the account number for this new unlisted credit union account. Once she emailed this form to her client's billing department this afternoon, her $4,500 monthly deposit would bypass the joint account entirely. Starting next week, the joint account would have nothing in it but Richard's paycheck. And as they had calculated the night before, his paycheck was already entirely spoken for, consumed by his debts, his car, and his parents' demands. He would have to face the cold, empty bottom of the barrel, and he would have to do it alone. "Here are your temporary checks and your debit card, Mrs. Vance," the bank representative said, returning to the desk with a blue plastic folder. "The direct deposit feature is fully active. Any funds sent to this account will be available immediately." "Thank you," Katherine said, sliding her documents and the blue folder into her leather tote bag. "You have been very helpful." She stood up, smoothing the front of her coat, and walked out of the credit union. The afternoon air was crisp and cool, a sharp contrast to the stuffy warmth of the lobby. She walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and pulled out her phone. Richard had sent another message. "Are you there? Please." Katherine tapped the screen. She typed a short, simple response. "I am in a meeting with a client. We will discuss this tonight when I get home." She hit send. She watched the small bubble turn from sending to delivered. She knew what would happen when she got home. Richard would be pacing the floor, frantic and desperate, waiting for her to solve his problems, to hand him the money that would patch the holes in his fragile ego. He would expect her to apologize for being quiet, to reassure him that everything would be fine, and to quietly transfer the funds to his mother so they could keep up appearances for the anniversary party. But she was no longer the glue. She turned the key in the ignition. Her car engine started with its familiar rattling hum. She adjusted her rearview mirror, backed out of the space, and drove toward the highway, leaving the credit union behind her. The second phase was complete. The quiet power had been gathered. The Cold War was over, and the silent preparation was about to begin. The dry, hard grains of jasmine rice clattered against the bottom of the stainless steel bowl. Katherine stood at the kitchen sink, running the cold tap over the rice. She plunged her bare hands into the water, feeling the sharp, tiny points of the grains against her skin. She swirled them in a slow, continuous circle. The water quickly turned a thick, milky white, clouded by the starch. She tilted the bowl, letting the cloudy water spill over the edge and down the drain, catching the escaping grains with her palm. She repeated the process: swirl, rinse, drain, 3 times until the water ran perfectly clear. Richard was sitting at the dining table, though he was not resting. His right leg was bouncing, a rapid, nervous tremor that made the floorboards vibrate slightly beneath Katherine's feet. His tie was completely gone. The top 3 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing the red, flush skin of his chest. His phone lay face up on the table, the screen dark but smudged with a day's worth of frantic thumbprints. "I don't understand how you can just stand there doing that," he said. His voice was brittle, carrying the ragged edge of someone who had spent the last 8 hours running on pure adrenaline and shame. "Doing what?" Katherine asked softly. She measured the fresh water, making sure it reached exactly the first knuckle of her index finger resting on the top of the rice. "Making dinner, like it is a normal Tuesday, like the sky isn't falling," Richard said. He stood up, the legs of his wooden chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I sent you 5 messages today, Katherine. My mother was practically hyperventilating on the phone. Clara actually drove over to my parents' house this afternoon with a basket of organic produce because Julian told her we were having cash flow problems and couldn't afford their groceries. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Clara showing up with pity vegetables?" Katherine took the bowl, wiped the wet exterior with a dry dish towel, and placed it gently into the electric rice cooker. She closed the lid until it snapped shut with a firm plastic click, then pressed the start button. A small red light illuminated. "I am sure Clara meant well," Katherine said. "She doesn't mean well. She is gloating," Richard snapped, taking a few steps toward the kitchen island. He stopped, running his hands over his face. The sound of his palms against his stubble was loud in the quiet room. "But that doesn't even matter. What matters is that we have to fix this, now." I checked the joint account. The remaining $250 never went out to my mom. You didn't transfer it. "I told you this morning, Richard, I do not have the liquidity to cover your parents' allowance," Katherine said. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a small package of chicken thighs. The plastic wrapping was cold and slick with condensation. He stared at her back. He took a sharp, jagged breath. "Fine, fine. You don't have the cash. I believe you. But we need a bridge, just a temporary bridge, until next month. I went online at lunch and applied for a small personal line of credit, just $5,000, enough to cover the caterer, the Audi payment, my parents, and give us a little breathing room." Katherine laid the chicken on a plastic cutting board. She did not turn around. "Oh?" "They denied it," Richard said, his voice dropping into a humiliated, hollow register. The algorithm denied it instantly. They said my debt-to-income ratio is too high because of the Q7 lease and the credit cards. And they flagged the return check from yesterday. My credit score took a hit overnight. I cannot get the loan in my name, Katherine. He stepped closer. She could smell the sour, nervous sweat on his collar, mingled with the fading, expensive scent of his sandalwood cologne. I need you to apply for it, he said. He did not ask. He presented it as the only logical next step in their partnership. Your credit is perfect. You don't have any major debt in your name. If you apply for the $5,000, we will be approved in 10 minutes. The money will be in the joint account by tomorrow morning. I can write a new check to Marcus. I can send my mother her money, and we can stop this nightmare before Julian finds out anything else. Katherine picked up her boning knife. The blade was cold and sharp. She began to trim the excess fat from the chicken thighs, separating the pale, rubbery strips from the pink meat. She made an internal calculation. The energy required to explain why she would never take out a high-interest loan to fund his parents' vanity party was immense. It would lead to an hour of screaming, accusations, and his eventual weaponized despair. The energy required to simply say no was minimal. I am not taking out a loan, Richard, she said. His bouncing legs stopped. The silence in the kitchen became sudden and absolute, broken only by the wet slicing sound of the knife moving through the meat. What do you mean you are not taking out a loan? He asked. His voice was quiet now, a dangerous, trembling quiet. It is just $5,000. I will pay the monthly installments myself out of my paycheck. You won't even have to look at it. No, she said, sliding the trimmed fat into the waste bin. Katherine, look at me, he demanded. She wiped her knife on a damp towel, set it down, and turned to face him. Her face was entirely blank, an unreadable mask of perfect metabolic restraint. She looked at his bloodshot eyes, his loosened collar, the desperate, angry clenching of his jaw. I am not signing a loan document, Richard. My name will not be attached to debt for a country club party, she said, her voice smooth and even. It is for my parents, he shouted, his frustration finally breaking its container. The shout echoed off the kitchen cabinets. He slammed his hand flat against the quartz countertop. The sharp, explosive smack made the empty wine glasses in the overhead rack rattle. They have given me everything. They paid for my college. They supported me when I started at the firm. I owe them this anniversary. We owe them. You are my wife. We are supposed to be a team. Katherine did not flinch at the sound of his hand hitting the counter. She looked at the red mark blossoming on his palm. We are a team, she said softly. But a team manages its reality. We cannot afford the pavilion. You have exactly $600 left from your paycheck to last the next 2 weeks. If you want to give that to your mother, you can. But I will not borrow $5,000 to pretend we are wealthy. Richard stared at her, his chest heaving. The polite, weaponized incompetence he usually relied on had been stripped away. He had always assumed her financial compliance was a given, an endless, renewable resource. To hit the bottom, to find cold, hard stone where he expected a cushion, was entirely incomprehensible to him. You are doing this on purpose, he whispered, his eyes narrowing. You are punishing me. Because I didn't want to use the cheap community hall for the party? Because Julian has a pool and we don't? You are trying to embarrass me in front of my own family. "I am making dinner," Katherine said. She turned back to the cutting board, picking up her knife. He stood there for another long moment, his breathing ragged. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. She heard his heavy footsteps marching up the wooden stairs. A door slammed on the second floor, a violent, rattling thud that shook dust from the door frames. Katherine remained at the counter. The water in the rice cooker began to boil, emitting a soft, rhythmic hissing sound as steam escaped from the small vent in the lid. The house smelled faintly of raw chicken, old cologne, and wet starch. She looked down at the neatly trimmed pieces of meat. The panic had officially breached the hull of his pride. He was drowning, and he was finally realizing that she was not going to throw him a life preserver. She picked up a pinch of salt and sprinkled it evenly over the chicken, her hand perfectly steady. The vibrating hum of Richard's electric toothbrush echoed through the bathroom wall, a rhythmic, buzzing vibration that Katherine felt through the floorboards as she stood by her desk. It was Wednesday morning, just past 8 o'clock. The morning was cool and overcast, the sky a flat, unbroken sheet of gray slate. Richard was executing his silent treatment with theatrical precision. He had not spoken a word since his outburst the previous evening. He had slept on the sofa, leaving the bedroom door wide open so she could see the neatly folded blanket he had used. This morning, his movements were loud, punctuated by the heavy slamming of dresser drawers, the aggressive rattling of the medicine cabinet, and the stomping of his leather shoes on the stairs. He was punishing her. He believed that by withdrawing his attention, his warmth, and his daily banter, he would create a vacuum of loneliness that would force her to capitulate. He expected her to crack under the weight of his disapproval and offer the loan to save his family's pride. Katherine stood by her physical filing cabinet in the small home office. She felt no vacuum. She felt only a profound, clearing stillness. His silence was not a punishment. It was a quiet, uninterrupted window of opportunity. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small silver key, and inserted it into the lock of the gray metal cabinet. The key turned with a dry, metallic click. She pulled the bottom drawer open. The heavy metal tracks squeaked softly, a sound she had grown to associate with her own private ledger. She pulled out a manila folder labeled Credit Accounts. Inside were the original contract agreements for their primary credit cards. Katherine sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her. She took a slow sip of her unsweetened black tea, letting the hot, bitter liquid settle in her throat. She looked at the documents. The primary card was an elite travel rewards card with a $20,000 limit. Katherine had opened it 6 years ago, before they were married, using her pristine credit and her independent income. When they married, Richard had insisted on being added to the account. He wanted the heavy, matte black metal card in his wallet. He liked the sound it made when he dropped it onto restaurant tables during business lunches. But Richard was not a joint owner. He was merely an authorized user. The legal responsibility for every dollar charged to that card rested solely on Katherine's shoulders. She opened her phone and dialed the customer service number printed on the back of her card. The call connected. A soft digital chime sounded, followed by the pleasant artificial voice of the automated system. Katherine entered her account number and her security passcode, her fingers tapping the keys with steady, unhurried rhythm. "Please state the reason for your call," the automated voice said. "Remove authorized user," Katherine said. Her voice was clear, low, and entirely devoid of hesitation. "I can help you with that," the voice replied. "Please enter the last 4 digits of the authorized card you wish to deactivate." Katherine looked at the folder. She entered the digits of Richard's card, 4829. "You are requesting to permanently deactivate the card ending in 4829, belonging to Richard Vance, and remove them as an authorized user. Is this correct?" "Yes," Katherine said. "This change is permanent and will take effect immediately. Do you wish to proceed?" "Yes." A brief pause followed, filled with the faint electronic static of the phone line. "The card ending in 4829 has been deactivated," the voice said. "A confirmation email has been sent to your primary address. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "No, thank you." She hung up the phone. She set it face down on the desk. With that simple 3-minute phone call, she had cut off Richard's primary source of emergency funding. He still had his personal credit card, but she knew from his legal pad scribbles the night before that his personal card was sitting less than $50 away from its maximum limit. If he attempted to use the black metal card today to pay his mother's medical bills or to buy a lavish lunch to impress Julian, the transaction would decline instantly at the terminal. She turned her attention to her laptop screen. She logged into the utility portals for the house, the electric company, the water district, the gas provider, and the high-speed internet service. For years, all of these bills had been set to automatic draft, pulling directly from her private credit union account to ensure the lights stayed on and the water kept running, without Richard ever having to think about it. Katherine clicked on the payment settings for the electric account. She selected the automatic draft option and clicked Deactivate. She updated the billing preferences, shifting the account from paperless digital delivery to physical paper billing. She did the same for the water, the gas, and the internet. She scheduled the changes to take effect on the 1st of the month. In 2 weeks, the high-speed internet would not automatically renew. The electric company would not quietly pull the $212 from her account. Instead, thick white paper envelopes with bright red delinquent warnings would begin to accumulate in the mailbox at the end of the driveway. They would sit on the kitchen island, waiting for Richard to open them, waiting for his empty joint checking account to cover the cost. From the hallway downstairs, she heard the heavy clunk of the front door closing. The lock turned, and then Richard's car engine started in the driveway, its low rumble vibrating through the window pane. Katherine did not walk to the window to watch him leave. She sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen as she clicked the final confirmation button on the gas utility portal. A small green checkmark appeared on the screen. "Your billing preferences have been updated," the text read. She closed the laptop. She took another sip of her tea, which had now gone lukewarm and bitter. The house was perfectly silent now, save for the steady, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock downstairs. The trap was being laid, piece by silent piece, and Richard was driving to work in his leased luxury car, entirely unaware that the floor beneath his feet had already begun to dissolve. Wednesday afternoon at 2:30, the bedroom was filled with a soft, filtered light that made the shadows on the wall appear long and pale. Katherine sat at her wooden vanity table, her fingers gently lifting the lid of a small black lacquer jewelry box. The box was decorated with hand-painted cherry blossoms, their pink petals slightly faded at the corners. It was the last gift her mother had given her, a quiet physical anchor to a life before Richard. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded red velvet, lay her maternal heritage. Katherine reached in and picked up her mother's solid gold locket. It was heavy, the surface slightly cool against her skin, engraved with a delicate pattern of ivy leaves. She wrapped it carefully in a small square of soft white flannel. Next, she removed her grandmother's emerald ring and a pair of simple freshwater pearl earrings. Each piece was wrapped individually, folded into neat, tight bundles that she placed into a small canvas zipper pouch. She was not packing to leave today, but she was preparing. Katherine made a quiet internal calculation. When the full weight of the financial collapse finally crushed Richard's pride, his panic would make him desperate. In his mind, anything in this house was a shared resource, meaning it was a resource he could leverage to save his own reputation. He had already borrowed her tax buffer without asking. If his credit cards remained maxed and his mother kept crying, it would only be a matter of time before he began looking through her drawers for things of value to pawn or sell. He would call it a temporary loan to get them through a rough patch. He would promise to buy them back. She was not going to give him that choice. Her mother's memory would not be pawned to pay for his brother's vanity or his parents' joint supplements. While she was zipping the canvas pouch, her phone on the vanity vibrated. The screen illuminated with an automated notification from her primary credit card application. Decline alert. A transaction of $78.50 at Metropolitan Grill was declined on card ending in 4829. Katherine stared at the notification. A faint, cold calm settled over her. Metropolitan Grill was a premium steakhouse downtown, the kind of place Richard went when he wanted to impress clients, or when Julian invited him out for a power lunch. Richard had clearly tried to swipe his matte black metal card to pay the bill. He had expected the card to slide smoothly through the terminal, emitting that pleasant high society double beep that signaled his membership in the comfortable middle class. Instead, the terminal had flashed red. Declined. Exactly 90 seconds later, the phone began to ring. Richard's name flashed on the screen. Katherine did not answer. She tapped the decline button, silencing the call, and instantly sent a pre-written text. In a meeting with a client, cannot talk. The response was immediate. The text bubbles bounced frantically before Richard's message appeared. "Why did my black card decline?" he wrote. "I am at lunch with my director and Julian. This is a nightmare. The waiter had to bring the machine back twice. Julian had to pay the bill. I have never been so humiliated in my life. Call me immediately." Katherine read the message. She did not reply. She swiped the notification away, clearing her screen, and placed the phone back in her purse. She took the canvas zipper pouch, walked down the stairs, and left the house. The drive to the Municipal Credit Union was 20 minutes of absolute quiet highway. The sky remained a heavy, unmoving gray, the cool air smelling of damp earth and coming rain. When she arrived, she walked straight to the customer service desk. A security guard with a heavy leather belt stood near the double doors, his eyes tracking her with polite disinterest. "I would like to access my safety deposit box, please," Katherine said to the clerk behind the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a quiet, efficient manner, nodded. "Certainly, Mrs. Vance. Please step this way." He led her through a heavy security door into the back of the branch, where a massive, foot-thick stainless steel vault door stood open. The interior of the vault was cool, the air dry, and smelling faintly of machine oil, brass polish, and old safety deposit ledgers. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of small metallic doors, each with 2 keyholes. The clerk pulled out a heavy black binder. "Please sign here," he said, pointing to the ledger page. Katherine took the pen. She signed her name with her usual steady, unhurried script. The clerk checked her signature against his digital record, then produced his guard key. He inserted it into the left keyhole of box number 312. Katherine reached into her purse, pulled out her own small brass key, and inserted it into the right keyhole. Together they turned the keys. The internal tumblers released with a heavy, metallic clink. The clerk pulled the long, narrow metal box from the wall and set it on a viewing table in the small, private alcove. "I will leave you to your privacy, Mrs. Vance. Please close the box and knock on the door when you are finished." "Thank you," Katherine said. She stood alone in the small alcove. The quiet of the vault was absolute, a thick, heavy silence that felt like a protective shield. She lifted the lid of the metal box. Inside lay her passport, her birth certificate, the original deed to her grandmother's small cabin in the woods, and her private bank documentation. She opened the canvas zipper pouch. She took out the flannel-wrapped bundles of her mother's jewelry and placed them neatly at the bottom of the metal box, right next to her passport. She closed the lid. The cold metal made a solid, satisfying clink as it settled into place. She had spent 5 years being the shock absorber for Richard's family, but today she was building a vault of her own. Her assets, her identity, and her maternal memories were now sealed behind a foot of solid steel, entirely out of Richard's reach. She knocked on the heavy security door, her hand steady, ready to return to the world where his fragile pride was slowly, inevitably turning to ash. The drizzle had turned into a steady, quiet rain by 6 o'clock. Through the kitchen window, Katherine watched the water droplets slide down the glass, merging into tiny, erratic rivers that blurred the dark outline of the oak trees in the backyard. The smell of wet asphalt and cold earth seeped through the cracks of the old window frame, mingling with the clean, grassy scent of the loose jasmine tea she was preparing. She stood at the counter, her hands moving through her evening routine with calm, practiced efficiency. She measured 2 teaspoons of the rolled green leaves into a glass teapot, then poured the hot water over them. She stood still, watching the tightly curled leaves slowly unfurl in the hot liquid, expanding like tiny, waking hands reaching toward the light. The front doorknob rattled violently. The door burst open, and Richard stepped into the hallway. He did not have an umbrella. His hair was damp, plastered to his forehead in dark, messy strands, and his $800 suit jacket was spotted with rain, its shoulders slightly slumped and wet. He stood in the entryway for a second, his chest rising and falling rapidly before he marched into the kitchen. His face was flushed, a deep, angry red that contrasted sharply with the pale, wet skin around his eyes. He threw his briefcase onto the kitchen island. It hit the quartz surface with a loud, hollow thud, sliding until it bumped against the toaster. "Why did you do it?" he demanded. His voice was raw, trembling with a mixture of rage, exhaustion, and raw, agonizing humiliation. Katherine did not turn around. She placed the lid onto the glass teapot, the metal rim making a soft, delicate clink. "Do what, Richard?" "Don't play stupid with me," he yelled. The sound of his shout bounced off the tile backsplash, sharp and jarring in the quiet kitchen. "You deactivated my card. You called the bank and removed me as an authorized user." Katherine turned slowly to face him. She rested her hands on the edge of the counter behind her, her posture relaxed, her face entirely serene. "I did," she said. Richard took a step closer, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He was trembling so hard his wet collar shook. "I was sitting at a table with my regional director and my brother, Katherine. Do you have any idea what happened?" The waiter brought the bill. I dropped the black card on the leather tray. I didn't even look at it. 5 minutes later, the waiter came back. Not a busboy, the head waiter. He leaned down and whispered, loud enough for Julian to hear, "Sir, this card is no longer active. It has been permanently deactivated by the primary account holder. Do you have another form of payment?" He choked on the words, his eyes wide and wild as he relived the moment. Julian laughed. Richard whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, devastating shame. He actually chuckled and patted my shoulder. He said, "Don't worry, little brother. I will put it on my corporate card. I know things are a little tight for you right now, with the anniversary coming up." My boss looked at me like I was a charity case, Katherine. He looked at me with pity. Julian spent the rest of the lunch talking about his new portfolio, while I sat there like a child who had his lunch money confiscated. He took another step, his breath smelling of the sour, expensive wine he had ordered to look important. "Why would you do that to me? In front of my brother? You are my wife. You are supposed to protect me." "I was protecting myself, Richard," Katherine said. Her voice was cool, level, and entirely steady. "The credit limit on that card is tied directly to my personal credit score. With our joint account in the negative, your car lease payment failing, and a bounced caterer check, you are a high-risk liability. I cannot afford to have a $20,000 credit line accessed when we are struggling to cover basic utilities." "A high-risk liability?" Richard echoed, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "You are talking about me like I am a stranger, like I am a corporate debtor. I bought this house. I lease the car we drive. Everything I do, every penny I spend, is to make sure we look respectable, to make sure we aren't viewed as failures. You leased a luxury car we could not afford to impress your brother," Katherine said, her voice dropping into a quiet, devastating rhythm. "You wrote a $500 check you did not have to impress your parents. I did not make those decisions, Richard. You did. And now you have to manage the consequences." "I have $40 in cash, Katherine," he shouted, his eyes filling with sudden, angry tears. $40! My personal credit card is sitting at its maximum limit. I cannot even buy gas to get to the office tomorrow. My mother called me 3 times this afternoon, asking when the rest of her grocery money is going to clear. How am I supposed to pay for anything? How am I supposed to survive?" "I suggest you ask Julian," Katherine said. Richard froze. The name hung in the damp air of the kitchen like a block of ice. "Julian?" he whispered. "You want me to ask Julian for a loan? You know what that would do. He would tell my father. My mother would know. They would never look at me the same way again. They would think I am a failure." "You already owe him $50 for your steak lunch," Katherine said softly. She turned back to the counter, picked up her glass teapot, and poured the steaming jasmine tea into a small ceramic cup. The pale green liquid was clear, the leaves having settled quietly to the bottom of the pot. Richard stared at her back. The anger in his face was slowly being replaced by a cold, hollow terror. He was realizing, with absolute certainty, that there was no loophole. There was no secret reserve. The quiet, compliant woman who had spent 5 years absorbing his family's vanity had simply walked away from the stove, and the house was growing cold. He did not scream again. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the rain tapping softly against the glass window pane behind him, before he picked up his wet briefcase and walked slowly down the hall toward the stairs. His steps were heavy, slow, and entirely defeated. Katherine took a sip of her tea. It was warm, clean, and perfectly bitter. The rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic hum against the roof of the house. It was 11:30 on Wednesday night. Downstairs, the living room was dark, save for the faint, shifting blue glow of the television screen, where Richard had fallen asleep on the sofa, his face pressed against a throw pillow. Katherine stood at her desk in the small home office, her movements quiet, deliberate, and entirely systematic. She held a small, black, external hard drive in her hand. It was no larger than a deck of playing cards, its matte plastic casing cool and heavy. She inserted the black cord into the side port of her laptop. The machine let out a soft, digital chime. On her screen, a folder opened, revealing the progress bar of her digital backup. Katherine sat down. She watched the blue LED light on the external drive begin to flash, a tiny, rapid heartbeat in the darkened room. The only other sound was the high-pitched, nearly silent whir of the laptop cooling fan, exhausting a thin stream of warm, plastic-scented air onto her fingers. She was performing her final physical routine of the silent preparation phase. For 3 hours, she had been systematically copying files. She was not deleting anything from the shared computer. She was simply collecting her ledger. She dragged and dropped her tax returns, her business incorporation documents, and 5 years of bank statements from their joint checking account. She opened a folder she had spent the last week compiling, labeled Vance Joint Liabilities. Inside was a single master spreadsheet. Over 5 years, Katherine had meticulously documented every single transfer she had made from her private savings account into the joint checking account to cover Richard's overdrafts, his leased luxury car payments, and his bi-weekly transfers to his parents. She scrolled down the column of figures. $300 here to prevent a bounced electricity check. $700 there to cover the Audi lease. $400 for his mother's joint supplements. At the bottom of the sheet, the grand total stood in crisp black numbers. $42,684. This was the documented truth of their marriage. Richard had spent 5 years pretending to be the provider, the successful junior executive who took care of his family, while Katherine had quietly injected over $40,000 of her own sweat and labor into his hollow shell, just to keep the roof from caving in. She clicked the print button. In the corner of the room, her laser printer warmed up with a low mechanical growl. The rollers clicked, and then the machine began to spit out the pages, one by one, with a rhythmic, sliding hiss. The fresh paper was warm, smelling faintly of heated ink and dry ozone. Katherine gathered the pages. She tapped them against the desktop to align the edges, then slid them into a sleek black leather portfolio alongside her new credit union documentation. She took her small silver key, locked the portfolio, and placed it inside her leather tote bag. Her phone on the desk buzzed once. It was an email notification from her primary freelance client's billing department. "Hi, Katherine," the email read. "We have successfully processed your request to update your direct deposit information. Your upcoming payment of $4,500, scheduled for processing on the 1st of the month, will be routed to your new credit union account. Please let us know if you need any further assistance." Katherine closed her email client. She logged out of her browser, cleared her search history, and shut down her laptop. The screen faded to black, extinguishing the pale blue light that had illuminated her face. She made a quiet internal calculation. Today was Wednesday. The 1st of the month was exactly 10 days away. When the 1st of the month arrived, the joint account would not receive her $4,500 deposit. Under normal circumstances, that money would have cleared the outstanding credit card balances, paid the mortgage, and provided the buffer for Richard's next spending cycle. But next month, the mortgage payment of $2,200 would attempt to auto-draft from a joint account that would contain nothing but Richard's remaining salary, which, after his Audi payment, his mother's allowance, and his credit card cash advance repayments, would be virtually non-existent. He would have to choose between paying the mortgage on the house he claimed to own or paying the lease on the luxury car he claimed to drive. He would have to explain to his mother why the second half of her allowance never arrived. He would have to explain to his brother why the country club party was canceled. He would have to face the absolute, unvarnished reality of his own income. From the floor below, she heard a muffled, cracking sound. It was the television screen shifting to a commercial, the sudden rise in volume traveling through the floorboards before being silenced. Then came the sound of Richard's heavy, dragging footsteps as he moved from the sofa to the guest room down the hall. He did not come upstairs. He did not knock on her door. Katherine stood up from her desk. She picked up her leather tote bag, carrying her locked portfolio, her mother's wrapped jewelry, and her secure digital backups. She walked to the closet, placed the bag on the top shelf behind her winter coats, and closed the wooden door until the latch clicked shut. The physical boundaries were set. The financial iron curtain was fully drawn. The silent preparation was complete, and the stage was set for the catalyst. She walked to the window, resting her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the rain continued to fall in the dark, washing away the dust of the driveway, dissolving the illusions of the house, dollar by silent dollar. The dry, rhythmic brush of the broom bristles against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the hallway. It was 9 o'clock on Thursday morning. Katherine stood in the entryway, sweeping the small particles of dried mud and dust into a neat, compact pile near the front door. Her movements were slow, repetitive, and entirely focused on the physical routine. She felt the rough, unfinished grain of the wooden broom handle sliding through her palms. The morning air was cold and damp, carrying the lingering smell of the overnight rain that had finally stopped, leaving the driveway slick and dark. On the wooden console table near the mirror, her phone began to vibrate. It was not Richard's name that appeared on the screen. It was Evelyn's. Katherine did not stop sweeping immediately. She finished her stroke, gathering the last of the dust into the pile before she set the broom against the wall. She walked to the console, picked up the phone, and swiped to answer. "Good morning, Evelyn," Katherine said, her voice dropping into its usual calm, level register. "Katherine," Evelyn said. The tone was different. The polite, melodic lilt she had used for 5 years was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp edge that carried no warmth, no sweet daughter-in-law pleasantries, and no pretense of family affection. The mask had completely slipped. "I am calling because Richard is too ashamed to tell you himself," Evelyn said. "He came over to our house late last night. He was completely distraught, Katherine. He was in tears. He told us everything. He told us about the bank accounts, about you deactivating his credit cards, and about how you are refusing to let him use your savings to pay for our anniversary." Katherine stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the neat pile of dust on the floor. Her hand on the receiver was steady, but her mind made a swift, cold, internal calculation. Richard had gone to them. He had crawled to his parents' house in the middle of the night, desperate to shift the blame for his financial failure. To save his own pride, he had crossed the final, absolute boundary. He had exposed her private savings account, the $12,000 her mother had left her, to the very people who viewed her as nothing more than an unpaid utility. "He told us you have over $12,000 sitting in a private account," Evelyn said, her voice rising with a sharp, self-righteous indignation. $12,000, Katherine, while your father-in-law is in agony because we cannot afford his massage, and I am being humiliated at the pharmacy register. How dare you sit on that money while this family is struggling?" "That money was left to me by my mother, Evelyn," Katherine said softly. "It is my personal savings. It is not family money." "Your mother is gone, Katherine," Evelyn snapped, the words cold and dismissive. "We are your family now, and in this family, we take care of each other. Everything you have belongs to this family. Richard has worked his fingers to the bone to provide you with a beautiful home, a luxury car, and a respectable life. The least you can do is support him when he needs to honor his parents." "Richard cannot afford the country club, Evelyn," Katherine said, her voice remaining entirely flat, a simple statement of fact. "He cannot afford his car. He cannot afford the lifestyle he has been pretending to live." "That is not your concern," Evelyn shouted, her composure cracking. "That is a banking transition, and you know it. Julian told us everything. He said you are deliberately withholding the funds to embarrass Richard because you are jealous of Julian and Clara's home. It is spiteful, Katherine. It is ugly." She paused, taking a long, ragged breath over the static-filled line. "I want you to transfer $5,000 to Richard's account today," Evelyn demanded, her voice dropping into a hard, threatening whisper. "We expect it done by noon. If you do not, Julian is going to take over the anniversary party. We will move it to the golf club, and we will make sure every single person in our social circle knows exactly why you and Richard were excluded. We will not let you ruin our son's reputation. Do you understand me?" Katherine did not answer. The heavy, demanding silence hung in the hallway of the quiet house. Evelyn waited for 3 seconds, her breathing loud and wet through the receiver, before she slammed the phone down, ending the call with a sharp electronic click. Katherine lowered the phone. She set it face down on the wooden console table. She stood in the quiet hallway for a long moment, the cool morning air draft creeping beneath the front door, chilling her ankles. She looked at the broom resting against the wall, then down at the neat pile of dust she had gathered. Richard had crossed the final line. He had offered up her mother's legacy, her only remaining physical connection to her past, to satisfy his family's insatiable vanity. He had invited them into her private sanctuary, hoping their collective pressure would force her to crumble. They thought she was a natural resource they could draft, a soft, compliant buffer they could squeeze whenever the reservoir ran low. They thought their anger would frighten her into obedience. But she felt no fear. She felt only a profound, crystalline clarity. She picked up the broom. She swept the pile of dust into the dustpan, carried it to the kitchen, and emptied it into the trash bin. The targets had crossed the final line. The catalyst had been triggered, and the countdown to the execution had officially begun. The office of Margaret Cole was quiet, situated on the 3rd floor of a restored brick building downtown. Through the tall, arched window, the afternoon sun cast long, amber rectangles across the polished mahogany floorboards. The room smelled of beeswax polish, old leather-bound books, and the dry, pleasant scent of high-grade bond paper. In the corner, a small brass carriage clock ticked with a rapid metallic precision. Katherine sat in a deep hunter-green leather armchair. She held a cup of cold water, watching the condensation bead on the glass and roll slowly down to wet her fingertips. Across the wide mahogany desk sat Margaret, a woman in her late 50s with sharp, observant eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She was slowly turning the pages of the black leather portfolio Katherine had brought. The only sound in the office was the crisp, dry rustle of the paper ledger she had printed the night before. "This is extraordinary documentation, Katherine," Margaret said, her voice measured and professional. "Most clients in your position have no paper trail for the invisible subsidies they provide to their households. They transfer cash, they pay bills directly, but they never keep a ledger." "I kept the records because I knew the math would eventually fail," Katherine said. Her voice was level, carrying the calm, steady tone of a business analyst presenting a quarterly report. Margaret nodded, tapping her finger against the grand total at the bottom of the spreadsheet. $42,684. Every transfer is logged with the corresponding bank confirmation number. This is a solid, undeniable history of asset diversion. Richard has been converting your separate, non-marital income to subsidize his parents' personal expenses and maintain a lifestyle beyond his actual means. She closed the portfolio and leaned back in her chair, resting her hands on the desk. "I did a preliminary check on the property deed and the vehicle registries," Margaret continued. "Richard was very thorough when he set up your domestic arrangements. The mortgage for the house is in his name only. The lease for the Audi Q7 is also in his name only." A faint, cold smile touched Katherine's face, disappearing instantly. "Yes, he insisted on it. He told me he wanted to be the one who provided the roof over our heads. He said it was his responsibility as a husband." Margaret let out a soft, dry chuckle. "His vanity is your greatest shield, Katherine. Because your name is not on the mortgage and not on the vehicle lease, you have absolutely zero personal liability for those debts. If he fails to pay, the lenders cannot touch your personal accounts, your credit union assets, or your freelance income. The financial risk rests entirely on him." "What about the division of assets?" Katherine asked. "Since you have no joint real estate holdings and no joint debt beyond a minor balance on a credit card you have already secured, this is a very clean separation," Margaret explained. "We will file a petition for legal separation with a motion for reimbursement of the $42,000 in separate funds he used to support his family. We will also request an immediate freeze on any attempts he makes to access your personal bank accounts." "I want the filing to coincide with the first of the month," Katherine said. Margaret looked at her over her glasses. "The first of the month?" "That is when the mortgage and his car lease draft are scheduled." "Yes," Katherine said, taking a slow sip of her water. "That is exactly why." Margaret stared at her for a moment, a look of profound, quiet respect crossing her face. "That is very strategic, Katherine. If we serve him on the first, his accounts will already be empty. He will have no buffer, and he will be legally blocked from attempting to claim you abandoned your financial obligations. The bank drafts will fail, the lenders will contact him directly, and he will have to face the reality of his liabilities without any legal recourse to demand your assistance." "I will prepare the paperwork," Margaret said, pulling a yellow legal pad toward her. "My retainer is $1,500. I can have the petition drafted and ready for the process server by Monday." Katherine reached into her purse. She pulled out her new matte blue credit union debit card, the one linked to her private unlisted account. She handed it to Margaret. "Process the retainer today, please," Katherine said. Margaret took the card, her fingers cool as they brushed Katherine's. "Certainly." Katherine sat in the quiet office, listening to the carriage clock tick. She felt no panic, no regret, and no sorrow. She felt only the cold, mechanical satisfaction of a puzzle piece sliding perfectly into place. Richard had gone to his parents, hoping to use their collective anger to shatter her boundaries. He had tried to weaponize her mother's legacy to feed his family's pride. But in doing so, he had triggered the final, unstoppable sequence. His vanity had built the cage. His pride had locked the door. And now she was simply walking away with the keys, leaving him to face the cold, dark winter of his own math. The air in the entryway was cold, carrying the damp, metallic scent of the lingering mist outside. It was 5:30 on Thursday evening. Katherine stood by the front door, her hands performing her quiet, physical routine. She unbuttoned her wool coat, hung it neatly on a wooden hanger in the closet, and placed her keys into the small porcelain tray on the console table. The keys settled with a sharp, familiar clink that echoed softly in the quiet house. She slid her feet out of her leather boots, placing them on the rubber mat to dry. The house was dark, save for the pale amber light filtering in from the street lamps outside. There was a strange, heavy stillness in the air, a suffocating silence that felt thick and unsettled. Katherine walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. Richard was standing by the kitchen island. He had not turned on the overhead lights. He stood in the dim shadow, his silhouette sharp and tense against the pale blue glow of the digital clock on the microwave. He was still wearing his work trousers, but his shirt was wrinkled, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. On the quartz counter, resting directly beneath the faint light of the microwave, sat her black lacquer jewelry box. The lid was wide open, tilted back to reveal the empty red velvet compartments inside. The red velvet looked bright, almost blood-colored, under the digital clock light. "Where is it?" Richard asked. His voice was a low, dry rasp. He did not look at her. He stood with his palms resting flat on the edge of the quartz, his knuckles protruding sharply. "Where is what, Richard?" Katherine asked, her voice remaining perfectly even, as cool and dark as the hallway behind her. "The jewelry," he whispered, finally turning his head to look at her. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and hollowed out by a deep, frantic panic. The skin around his nose and mouth was tight and pale. "I went to the vanity. I was looking for your mother's gold locket, the emerald ring, the pearl earrings. The box is completely empty, Katherine. The drawers are cleared out. You took them. Why would you take them out of the house?" Katherine walked to the other side of the island. She looked down at the empty lacquer box, then up at him. She felt no anger, no shock, and no urge to defend herself. She made a quiet, instant, internal calculation. Richard had gone into her private bedroom drawers. He had searched her jewelry box while she was out. He was not looking to admire her mother's things. He was looking for assets to liquidate. He had reached the point of predatory desperation, willing to pawn her maternal heritage to pay his leased car fee and cover his mother's demands before the first of the month. "What were you planning to do with them, Richard?" she asked softly. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently beneath his stubble. "I was just checking on them," he lied, his voice rising in a sharp, defensive spike. "We are married, Katherine. Everything in this house is ours. I wanted to see if we had anything of value we could use as leverage, just until the bank delay is sorted out, to get my mom her money and pay the caterer. It is family property. If you had just transferred your savings like I asked, I wouldn't have had to look." He took a step closer, his hands shaking as he pointed at the empty red velvet. "You thought I was going to steal them? Is that what you think of me? You treated me like a criminal. You locked me out of the credit cards, and now you are hiding your jewelry like I am some kind of thief." "My mother's jewelry is in a secure safety deposit box at the credit union," Katherine said, her voice smooth and entirely steady. "It is completely out of your reach, Richard, and it will remain there." Richard stared at her, his mouth opening slightly, but no sound coming out. The anger seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving him looking hollow, fragile, and utterly defeated. He collapsed onto one of the bar stools, his shoulders slumping forward as he buried his face in his hands. "Julian called me again," he whispered, his voice trembling, muffled by his palms. "The golf club is booked. Julian paid the $5,000 deposit himself this afternoon. He told the caterer that I was having some financial difficulties, so he had to step in to save the family event. He told my mom. He is telling everyone at the office, Katherine. He let out a ragged, shaking sob, his chest heaving beneath his wrinkled shirt. My father called me a disappointment, Richard cried, his tears spilling over his knuckles. He said he was glad Julian was there to act like a real son. They are all going to the golf club on the 1st of the month. My mother told me not to bother showing up if I am just going to bring tension to the table. They uninvited me, Katherine, from my own parents' anniversary. He looked up at her, his face wet, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading. "You did this to me," he sobbed. "You ruined my relationship with my family. If you had just helped me, Julian wouldn't have had this leverage. You let them think I am a failure. You destroyed your relationship with your family the moment you spent money you did not have to buy respect you did not earn," Katherine said. She turned away from him. She picked up her keys from the console table, slipped them into her coat pocket, and picked up her leather tote bag containing her locked legal portfolio. "Where are you going?" Richard asked, panic rising in his voice as he stood up from the stool. "Katherine, please, don't leave. We have to talk. We have to figure this out." "I am going to get some dinner," Katherine said. She did not look back at him. She walked down the hallway, her steps quiet and measured. She opened the heavy front door, stepped out onto the damp porch, and closed the door behind her. The lock clicked shut with a solid, echoing thud. She walked down the driveway toward her paid-off compact car. The air was cold, the evening mist settling quietly over the suburban lawns, washing away the dirt of the street. The targets had crossed the final line of betrayal. The catalyst had run its course, and the trap was now fully primed. On the 1st of the month, the financial Iron Curtain would fall, and Richard would be left alone in his empty house with nothing but his luxury car lease, his empty joint account, and the cold, unyielding truth of his own math. The morning of the 1st of the month arrived with a sharp, biting cold that cleared the air of the autumn mist. The sky was a brilliant pale blue, entirely cloudless. Katherine stood by the trunk of her car, placing her final cardboard box inside. It contained her freelance client files, her notebooks, and a small framed photograph of her mother. She closed the trunk lid. It shut with a quiet, solid click that felt remarkably light. Richard stood on the wooden porch of the house. He looked thin, almost translucent in the bright morning light. He had not shaved in days, and his expensive suit trousers were wrinkled, hanging loosely from his hips. In his hand he held his phone. The screen was flashing continuously, a rapid, silent vibration that he seemed unable to stop. Katherine did not need to see the screen to know what the alerts were saying. At 6 o'clock, the mortgage payment of $2,200 had attempted to auto-draft from the joint checking account. Finding only $9.12, the transaction had failed. At 6:05, the automated lease payment of $750 for the Audi Q7 had also failed, instantly triggering a second late penalty. At 6:10, the high-speed internet service had been disconnected. The digital utilities of his constructed life were failing, one by one, like lights turning off in an empty stadium. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb at the end of the driveway. A man in a plain charcoal suit stepped out, carrying a thick manila envelope. He walked up the concrete path, his eyes scanning the house, before they settled on Richard. "Richard Vance?" the man asked, his voice flat and professional. Richard nodded slowly, his face blank. The man handed him the envelope. "You have been served," he said. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving the driveway with a quiet crunch of gravel. Richard looked down at the envelope. His hands were trembling so hard the paper rustled in the quiet morning air. He tore open the flap and pulled out the thick stack of documents. At the top of the first page, the bold black letters read, "Petition for legal separation, division of liabilities, and motion for asset reimbursement." Attached to the back was a copy of the master spreadsheet Katherine had printed, the meticulous ledger documenting $42,684 in separate funds she had used to cover his vanity over the past 5 years. Richard looked up from the papers, his bloodshot eyes searching her face. His voice was a thin, dry whisper that barely carried across the driveway. "Katherine," he whispered, "please, I have nothing. The bank is going to repossess the car next week. The mortgage lender said they are initiating default proceedings if the account isn't cleared by Friday. My credit card is completely frozen." He took a step off the porch, his knees shaking beneath his trousers. "My mother won't answer my calls," he sobbed, the tears finally spilling over his eyelids and running through his stubble. "Julian hosted the anniversary party at the golf club today. They are all there right now. Julian, Clara, my parents. My dad told Julian that he was the only son who made him proud. They didn't even invite me, Katherine. They told me that if I couldn't pay my share, I was just a burden to their reputation. I am completely alone in this house." Katherine looked at him. She felt no anger, no triumph, and no urge to offer a comforting lie. She felt only a vast, clean space where her burden used to be. "You chose the appearance of wealth over the reality of respect, Richard," she said softly. "You built this house of cards to feed a family that only loved you for the illusions you could buy them. I am simply no longer holding up the walls." She walked to the driver's side of her car, opened the door, and slid inside. The engine started with a quiet, reliable hum, the sound of a paid-off vehicle that belonged entirely to her. She backed out of the driveway. In her rear-view mirror, she saw Richard standing alone on the porch of the house he could not afford, clutching the manila envelope of his liabilities, surrounded by the empty shells of his leased luxuries. She drove away. 2 hours later, Katherine sat on the porch of her new home, a small, sunlit wooden cottage nestled near the edge of a quiet lake surrounded by towering pine trees. The air was clean, smelling of fresh pine needles and damp earth. She held a warm ceramic mug of tea, her fingers absorbing the dry, radiating heat. Her mother's solid gold locket rested warm against her collarbone, secure and safe. For the first time in 5 years, Katherine leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and took a deep, full breath of cold, clean air. She was free. Her suffering had not been in vain. She had drawn her boundary in the dirt, and the truth had finally set her free. If this story reminded you that families should never take love for granted, and that dignity is a quiet boundary that must never be crossed, you are not alone. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is not continuing to carry a burden that was never yours to bear, but having the strength to set it down and walk away. What would you have done in Katherine's place? Would you have quieted your voice and calculated your exit, or would you have stood your ground much earlier? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your perspective might be the very light someone else needs to find their own way out of the dark. If you believe in stories of quiet resilience, justice, and the courage to rebuild life on your own terms, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share these meaningful journeys of truth, resilience, and second chances. Because in the end, a life built on the hollow, shifting sands of appearances will always crumble. But a life rooted in quiet truth and self-respect will weather any storm.